Here we are. You're at the end of the course. You've watched all the other content, and we are left with one final bonus lesson. In this lesson, I'm going to teach you how to become a Photoshop and Illustrator artist that other people actually want to work with. I'm going to teach you how to prepare your artwork in a way that when you hand it off to an animator or motion designer, they'll be able to import it into After Effects and have no issues. Or if you are the motion designer, I'm going to cover best practices on how to prepare your artwork so that when you transfer it over, you don't have any kind of translation issues. Because the fact is, there is not a one-to-one translation from Photoshop to After Effects or Illustrator to After Effects. Some things are not supported and carried over, so you need to know how to prep that artwork. Now, if you've never used After Effects before, don't worry. You don't need to get caught up in what I do inside of After Effects here. If you don't understand exactly how it works, you can learn that down the road, but how you prep the artwork in this lesson and how I teach it to you is still applicable. So don't get too scared by that. I'm going to explain all of this to you through my Ninja Gear boards inside of Photoshop, as well as those 2D Elements Illustrator files that I also have. So let's look at this in Photoshop and first talk about what's going to translate over. If we look at this first frame, it's made up of a colored background, so that's going to transfer over no problem. A background texture, that will come in as a rasterized image, as if I had exported it at this resolution. And that's important because After Effects does not take that smart object into account. It doesn't translate that and preserve the resolution like Photoshop does. So be aware of that. I would generally recommend that you leave the smart objects in the PSD because the After Effects will just treat it as if it was a rasterized layer while still preserving the smart object within the Photoshop document. So for any reason the animator needed to come back into Photoshop and scale it up and re-export it, they could. So keep that in mind with smart objects. Layer styles. A lot of layer styles do transfer over into After Effects. Remember, After Effects was actually built to kind of be the Photoshop of video. So you're going to find a lot of the very same filters and effects in After Effects as you do in Photoshop. Not all of them transfer over though. So let's take a look at a layer with a layer style like this inner glow. That is an option in After Effects. That's going to transfer over just fine. And in fact, the animator can choose how they want to import it in After Effects and even preserve the editability of that layer style or merge it directly into the artwork. Totally up to them. So leave those effects, no problem there. Smart filters, these will not transfer over, at least not non-destructively. They will, again, be merged into the layer, just like the resolution is kind of baked in once you export it and put it into After Effects. So the PSD will preserve that. The animator can come in and adjust anything they need to in the PSD, but they're not going to transfer over editably inside of After Effects. So be aware of that. I'd encourage you to just leave them there so that the animator has access to them if they need it. Adjustment layers do transfer over, but not in the way that I think they should. This is just one of those issues between the two programs where things don't work logically, or at least not the way that I think they should. You can have an adjustment layer inside of After Effects that you can apply any number of effects to, and it will be applied to any layer underneath it, whereas in Photoshop we have a single layer per adjustment, but when you transfer this over into After Effects, it shows up as a Photoshop layer that's been rasterized and then converted to an adjustment layer with the effect applied, assuming that effect is actually supported inside of After Effects. So I realize I'm talking kind of a mile a minute here. We're going to jump into After Effects so I can walk you through this. It's okay if you're not following along and understanding 100% yet, but what I'm trying to get across is that this adjustment layer will import into After Effects. It's just not going to show up in the way that the motion designer probably would have made it inside of After Effects, but it at least gets the effect in there and applies the adjustment properly. That's the important thing. So leave your adjustment layers in the PSD. Now, like I said, not all adjustments are supported inside of After Effects. Almost all of them are, but for whatever reason, these two right here, which we haven't even used in this course, color lookup and gradient map, do not. Everything else will show up as a filter that the animator can then make adjustments to inside of After Effects non-destructively. That doesn't mean you shouldn't use them in Photoshop. It's just something that you're going to have to be aware of and probably have a discussion with the person you're giving the files to ask them how they want you to handle this file prep. It's not a one-size-fits-all. You're going to do the same thing for every single project. Sometimes the animator isn't going to need access to these adjustment layers, and they're more concerned with just having a cleaned up document, and you might need to merge these adjustments into the layers. So why don't I show you how that works really quick? Let's take a look at the sheath and see that I have a curves and an unsharp mask applied to it. Remember, I said those two effects are not going to show up in After Effects, even though they are both filters that you can apply in After Effects. Let's say that the animator doesn't need access to those though, and we want to merge them into the layer. Well, unfortunately, this is a destructive edit, so we're not only going to be merging the effects into the layer, but also rasterizing the smart object, so we're not going to be able to scale it up without losing quality at this point. But it's important to understand how this works, so I'm going to show you how to do it. All you need to do is right-click on the layer and say Rasterize Layer. Not Rasterize Layer Style, but Rasterize Layer. I'll click on that. There we go. Now we have a single normal looking layer. Even though it's extending off to the side, it did preserve that, but the effects or those filters are now baked into this layer. It's no longer a smart object, and I can't make any more adjustments to those effects. They've been applied to the layer, no going back. Because my inner glow is supported in After Effects, I could leave this as is, but again, to show you how this works, I could right click on the layer and come up to Rasterize Layer Style, and that will again rasterize that effect, merge it into the layer, and I'm left with one single layer, no filters, no effects, and it's cleaned up and ready to be imported into After Effects. I'm going to undo both of those because, like I said, I want to preserve all that in the PSD just in case the animator needs to get access to it. They may even want to turn the effects off inside of Photoshop so that they have more flexibility and control with those same effects inside of After Effects. They can always copy over your settings from your filters inside of Photoshop with the filters that we have access to in After Effects. Okay, let's talk about masks. We have two different options here in Photoshop, vector masks and raster masks. I would highly recommend that you use vector masks as much as possible on things like adjustment layers and even cutting out photos unless it's something really complex and you need to use raster-based selection tools. The reason for that is because vector paths will translate into After Effects. So this vignette right here will translate into After Effects, and I can control the feathering inside of After Effects just like I do in Photoshop. I can manipulate the handles. It just makes it a lot less destructive than working with pixels. Now let's take a look at the next frame. This has two vector objects in it, but they are smart objects. So if I were to bring this into After Effects, it's going to look at both this flare and the burst in the background as if they've been rasterized, just merged inside of Photoshop. They're pixels now, no longer vector. That's why we're going to want to save our 2D elements in an Illustrator file so that the animator can take that Illustrator file in and preserve those vectors. After Effects can convert an Illustrator file into what it calls shape layers, which are vector layers inside of After Effects. Alright, I realize I'm doing a lot of talking and not showing, so why don't we get these files prepped to import into After Effects so you can actually see what happens. Well, one last thing that we need to talk about in Photoshop is that After Effects does not support artboards, whether they're in Illustrator or Photoshop. It kind of can translate them in a way that gives you access to everything, but it's a mess. The PSDs would be ginormous, so we really want to separate all these out into their own PSDs. Fortunately, that's pretty easy to do. All we have to do is come up to File, Export, Artboards to Files. This is going to give us a little menu with a bunch of options. So first of all, we're going to choose where to put it. I'm going to make a new folder on my desktop outside of my assets folder where everything else has been and make a new folder called Delivery. And everything that goes in this folder is what I'm actually going to hand off to the animator. All of these assets, everything in here is more for me, for making adjustments to things and working with my files and the assets they gave me. Delivery is the completed work that I'm going to hand off. Inside Delivery, I'm going to make another folder called PSD. This was where I will put all of my source PSDs. Click on Open, and then I can give my file names a prefix. Now, I've already named all of my artboards properly, so I don't need a prefix, but if these were just named 1, 2, 3, 4, then I could type in Ninja Gear Katana Boards _ and then it would add the name of the artboard at the end of that. But I already did that work, so I'm going to get rid of the prefix. I'm going to make sure that artboard content only is selected. Include overlapping areas would probably be fine too, but just keep it to artboard content only unless it gives you any issues. I could include the background in the export, but all of my backgrounds are completely filled, so I don't need to worry about that. I want to make sure the file type is set to PSD so that it preserves all of the Photoshop editability. And then under export options, I want to uncheck this box right here that says preserve artboard because I don't need the artboard in After Effects. That'll actually just make the file a little bit more messy for me inside of After Effects. With all that done, I'm going to click on Run, and this is a script. It's going to take a little bit of time because it has to process all of these 9 different artboards and separate them out into their own PSD. So it'll take a little bit of time, but once it's done, it should be ready to go into After Effects. All right, the artboards to files was successfully run. Now I can take a look at my delivery folder, and sure enough, there are my 9 artboards all separated out into their own PSDs. So if I open up one of them, we should be able to see what this looks like. And what it's done is actually put it inside of a group. It's moved everything that was in the artboard and put it into a group. I don't know exactly why Photoshop does this. We do not need to preserve that group. So I'm actually going to go through each artboard and ungroup it. Because again, that's just going to make the file messier for the animator inside of After Effects. But I'll ungroup it like that. And then, you know what? I also need to make sure that I'm labeling everything. This is something I should have already done inside of my main document, but I'm going to go ahead and do it here. I'm going to rename that background layer background and get rid of that layer mask. And on any other layers that don't need a layer mask, I'm going to get rid of that as well. So there's an adjustment layer with a mask. Don't need that. I think everything else looks named properly, so then I can save this. So I'm just going to quickly do this for all 9 boards. All right, all of that work is done, so let's jump into After Effects and see what it looks like to bring this artwork in. So I'm going to import. By the way, if you move on from this course and take After Effects Kickstart, you're going to learn a lot more about actually prepping files that have been given to you for importing into After Effects. So if a lot of this doesn't make sense, that's where you're going to learn a lot more of this process. But I'm just going to bring in one of these PSDs and show you what it looks like. So let me grab the first one, click on Open, and then import it as a composition retaining layer sizes. Again, none of this really matters. You don't need to retain it for this course, but I'm going to click OK so you can see how it comes in. So that's given me an object inside of After Effects called a composition. If I double click it, it's going to open up the same exact PSD except built in After Effects instead of Photoshop. Now, obviously, this doesn't look 100% the same because not everything translated over. If we look down here, this is our layers palette. Just like in Photoshop, we have layers over here. They're displayed in a timeline in After Effects because we're going to be working in time, animating things over time inside of After Effects. So it has to display it a little bit differently, but the layers come in named the same and in the same order. So in the very back, we have our background layer. This is it on its own. We've got our background texture, which is preserved the overlay blend mode that we set in Photoshop. We've got our Katana layer, which, like I said, does not preserve any kind of smart object scaling capabilities. If I bring up the scale for it, it is 100% scale. So if I were to scale this up a lot, we're going to lose quality. We've got our vignette layer, which is showing up as a rasterized Photoshop layer, but we have this little switch right here, which is telling us that it is an adjustment layer. You can actually use any layer inside of After Effects as an adjustment layer. And if I open up the layer and go into the effects, sure enough, there is a curves. If I look at the effects controls, there's the curves adjustment, exactly the same as I had done inside of Photoshop. There's that curves adjustment. Here it is in After Effects. So that's actually really nice to be able to make those kinds of adjustments in Photoshop and have them show up exactly the same in After Effects. What didn't transfer is the feathering of that mask. You can see that I have the mask right here, the vector mask, just like the vignette mask that I drew inside of here. There it is. But the feathering, which we had set to basically 200, did not come through. Fortunately, all I have to do is change the feathering to 200 in After Effects, and there we go, my vignette is nice and soft. We've got the color grade, which also came in as an adjustment layer. Same way, it looks like a regular Photoshop layer, but it's being treated as an adjustment layer. And I have that same color correction under my curves control. Remember, we added the S curve to the red and green channels, lifted the blue shadows, and dropped the blue highlights. And then finally, we have our grain layer, which also was set to overlay. And if I solo that layer, we can see what the grain looks like. It was preserved. There we go. So it's brought everything in pretty much exactly the same as what I had in Photoshop. Now, like I said, the animator may not have wanted to use these Photoshop layers as adjustment layers, but if they're in a bind or if they don't really mind, there's nothing wrong with using them. You could generate your own adjustment layers in After Effects by coming up to Layer, New, Adjustment Layer, and you can see that it looks a little bit different, but it behaves exactly the same way. The important thing is that the animator has access to the effects that do translate over, and that the artwork is ready to go and it's laid out in the same way that you had it inside of Photoshop. Now let's pull in one of the boards that has text, because this is something that is handled differently between Photoshop and Illustrator. If I bring in let's say this board right here, cut your veggies in style. This is going to bring in the text layers again as a Photoshop layer. Let's get this open. And it clearly doesn't look right. If I go into this pre-composition, which is basically After Effects' way of grouping things, I can see my text layers. I have access to each one of them. They're in the right spot, but they don't look right, and they're not actually text layers that I can edit. They're flattened, rasterized Photoshop layers, but I can right-click on them and come down to Create and say Convert to Editable Text. When I do that, it converts the layers into text layers inside of After Effects that I can then edit, and I can say, change this to cut up your veggies, and I can change the size of the font in the character palette if I needed to add that. I can do whatever I need to this text now, including taking this text and then changing the colors. So I think this was supposed to be the yellow background, so I'm going to sample this yellow color to find out what it was, go into my typography composition and make it yellow, and then I'm going to add a black outline, making sure that the fill goes over the stroke and that the stroke is, say, 2 points. I can even add some roundness to this, just like in Illustrator or Photoshop, but now that should be fairly similar to what I had inside of Photoshop. Now clearly the in style text, that stroke is much bigger, and for whatever reason the scale is way off on these. So I could either set these to 100 and then scale them up using the actual font size, or just turn down this stroke a little bit. That is something that can be left up to the animator. It's not a big deal. That's something that kind of comes with the territory. The motion designer is probably going to expect to have to manipulate some of the text layers to get them to line up properly so that they're ready to go and able to be animated in the way they need them to be. But for the most part, it transfers over those text layers pretty nicely. However, Illustrator doesn't. There is no create editable text layers from an Illustrator document. So that's something you really need to be aware of and probably have a discussion with the motion designer about how you should be handling that. Again, it kind of comes with the territory. As a motion designer, we expect that, and we know that if there's text inside of Illustrator, it's going to be a little bit of extra work to transfer it into After Effects. So don't sweat it, just make sure that you're communicating with the person you're working with. Now let's talk about Illustrator files and how After Effects handles those. So I'm going to jump into Illustrator and take a look at my 2D Elements file. First of all, I don't need any of these reference images in the background. That was purely for my own working, lining up these elements and seeing how they looked in context. But I want to give the animator these elements in a basically isolated view. I don't need the artboards and I don't need the references. So I'm first going to save this as a new file, save as, by pressing Command-Shift-S. And then put that on my desktop in the delivery folder, make an Illustrator folder, and call it 2D Elements. That's fine. Click on Save, click OK, and then get rid of all the artboards except for the first one. So I'm going to go to Edit Artboards, and on each one of these, click on it and press the Delete key. And that will remove those artboards so that I'm left with just the one. And then I want to get rid of all of these reference images. So I'm going to make sure everything's unlocked, and get rid of those reference images, and I'm left with all of these lines. So first of all, I want to just save this and bring it into After Effects so you can see what happens and how it handles the file as is, with all of these elements all over the place and all on one layer. So I'm going to import that. Let's find that Illustrator file, and then I'm going to put that inside a new composition. So there we go. It looks like we've got our elements stacked on top of each other, transparency in the background, that's great. But if I try and click and drag, you can see this has actually merged it all into one layer. There's nothing I can do with these shapes. But if I right click on this layer, After Effects allows me to say create shapes from vector layer. So if I click on that, it's going to convert it into an After Effects shape layer, which gives me access to all the vector paths, and it's even preserved those dashes on those lines. However, it is still all put onto one layer. If I open up this layer, I can get to all of the different contents. I can see every single one of those objects as a group, and inside each group, I have the paths, the stroke. This is how After Effects handles these kinds of things, but it is very messy. It's not labeled very well. And even if I had labeled my objects inside of Illustrator, those labels would not have come over. And if I zoom out real far, you can see that elements that were outside of the artboard actually were not preserved. They did not get brought in. We have these lines here for the sparks, some speed lines over here, down here, and here, but because they weren't in the artboard, they were not included in that file. So I'm going to delete those files out of After Effects and then try this again. We're going to prep this properly. First of all, I want to put every object that needs to be separate on its own layer. Now, we've already done this before. What we need to do is select the layer that has all the contents, all the objects we need in it. In this case, it's layer 1, it's the only layer. Click on this little menu up here and say Release to Layers Sequence. That puts all of the objects into their own layer, but they're all still contained within layer 1. So even if I brought this into After Effects now, it's still going to merge everything into this topmost layer, layer 1. So I want to grab all of the layers within that and drag them up above that layer 1, which is now empty. Delete that layer 1, and then merge the objects that should be on one single layer. So for instance, these little burst lines on the sparks should all be on one layer. So I'm going to cut that, and this was one of the layers that had that object. I'll paste in front with Command F, and then rename that layer Sparks. This layer is the burst that goes behind the flare. That should only have those lines, so I'm going to type in burst. This layer right here is empty. 11 is empty, 10 is empty, 9 is empty. So let's just get rid of those layers real quick. We've got layer 8. That's one of our speed lines. I'll put both of these objects on layer 8 and call it speed lines 1. So layer 7 is now empty. Layer 6 has a speed line. Layer 5 has a speed line. Let's call that speed lines 2. Get rid of layer 5. 4 and 3 are both speed lines as well. Speed lines 3. Get rid of layer 3, and then we finally have our flare. So I'll call that flare, and now everything is labeled properly, and they're all in their own layers, so they will come into After Effects properly. However, the artwork that's off the artboard still is not going to come in properly, so I want to move all of these elements into the center of the artboard. So I'm going to select them one at a time and just make sure that they are somewhere on this artboard. And it's going to be a little hard to see since these are white and the artboard is white, but if I press Command-Shift-D to bring up the transparency, then we can see them a little bit more clearly. It's still pretty hard with that background, but all of my elements are now at least partially on the artboard, and that's what matters. So I'm going to save this file now, and then go back into After Effects and re-import that same 2D elements. Click on Open, and this time I'm going to import it as a composition, just like I did with the PSD. Then I'll click on OK, go into that composition, and now I have all of my individual layers. So I've got my flare, my speed lines, my burst, and my sparks. But if I grab the burst and move it around, you can see that it's being cropped to the edges of the comp. And that's because it's still treating it as a rasterized image. It's just showing up as an Illustrator layer, but being rasterized, and we're not seeing the rest of the paths there. I can't edit the paths. So now if I select all of these, right-click on it and say Create Shapes from Vector Layer, it's going to convert all of these objects into shape layers that I can then edit as if they were in Illustrator. So let's grab the burst layer, and there we go. We can see all the paths. I can grab each one of these. It's converted that distort and transform that I used to repeat the line and just converted them into their own vector paths. I can go into my flare and manipulate this however I want. I could turn off that transparency in the background to see those sparks outlines, and I could even say make them thicker. I could do whatever I want here inside of After Effects to manipulate these vector paths however I need to. But because I separated them out into their own layers and I made sure they were all on that artboard, I know that when I give them to the animator, they're going to be able to convert them into vector shapes, no problem. Now these elements that I've created are very simple. They're just basic shapes with a solid fill and a solid stroke, with some dashes as the exception on the speed lines and on the bursts. There are actually a lot of things that are not going to transfer from Illustrator into After Effects shape layers. You can obviously save your artwork as an Illustrator file, bring it in, and not convert it to shape layers, and sometimes that's not a problem. But if you use things like gradients or brushes, anything that's not a uniform width stroke like this. Even things like blending modes or clipping masks can cause a lot of problems and not even transfer over when you create vector shape layers inside of After Effects. Some of the Illustrator filters may transfer over, or they might just get expanded, like the pucker and bloat just converted this to a path that is the shape of the pucker and bloat. I can't adjust that pucker and bloat anymore. Same thing with this burst. It was a distort and transform that was making a bunch of copies. It just expanded that and gave me all of these vector paths. So the editability isn't there, but at least it looks the same. Some filters and effects from Illustrator are not going to translate into After Effects. And the reality is that if you're using a lot of filters and effects and doing blending modes and a lot of shading and highlights and really intricate stuff inside of Illustrator, the animator isn't going to need access to these vector paths. You're just designing your artwork inside of Illustrator that the animator will then bring into After Effects and animate as if it was just a rasterized layer. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just something, one more time, I'm hammering it in. I know I sound like a broken record, that you need to have a discussion with the person you're working with to see what their needs are and to make sure that you're giving them what they need to do their job. Now, as you can tell, this is kind of a process getting things from Illustrator to After Effects, and there are some really smart people out there, one person in particular, Adam Pluff, who has made a extension for After Effects and Illustrator that allows you to transfer your graphics into After Effects with the push of a button. The name of the extension is Overlord, and it's really changed the game for transferring artwork from Illustrator to After Effects. It's not necessary that you learn how Overlord works in this video, but the fact is that there are people out there who are developing tools for helping you transfer artwork from one program to the other more efficiently and with more capabilities than After Effects has given us natively. For instance, Overlord preserves gradients, so you can bring those gradients over from Illustrator, no problem. They'll line up exactly as they look like in Illustrator. But like I said, you don't need to worry about that kind of thing until you're actually doing motion design and working in After Effects. So with that, I should have everything I need to give to the animator, knowing that they can have access to anything that they need to make adjustments to, or just bring them straight into After Effects as is and get to work. So if you can start organizing your files, labeling things properly, and thinking about how other animators and other people are going to be working with your files, you're going to become somebody that's really desirable to work with.